All right, so this is Implementing Domain-Driven Design Dev Book Club. We're discussing Chapter 7 Services today. We had a little bit of technical difficulties, so if you were watching this live, I don't think anyone is right now, but if you were, you would know that we're about 10 minutes late, so sorry about that. We had to reschedule from last week because I was woefully unprepared to actually lead this thing last week, so apologies about that as well. And with the apologies out of the way, joined by Jeremy Cook, and Adrian, I believe, is going to be muted again today, but we'll be keeping up with you in chat, Adrian. So if you have anything you want to say, or if we sound like we're saying something woefully inadequate, let us know, and we'll be happy to discuss it more. So, Jeremy, what did you think about the chapter?
I enjoyed it, and it was. I'm enjoying this book, but it was somewhat of a relief to reach a somewhat brief chapter as well. I don't know yeah, it sounds like you agree as well.
Definitely, yes. Yeah, like you said, it was just, the last two, I think they're very important, so I understand why there was material in them, but it was just, you get through it, you're just like, oh my goodness, I've done 30 pages and I've got 30 more.
Yeah.
So this one was definitely and I felt like it also flowed a little better. So
Yeah.
Some of the other ones I felt like they kind of dragged on as we were talking about.
I wonder if this is kind of like the eye of the hurricane, because I can imagine that domain events is going to be a massive chapter the next one. I haven't actually looked to see how many pages it is coming up, but just from what he's been saying so far.
I can only imagine. I'm looking at it right now, and it's pretty big. Of course, chapter 9 is really short, apparently. So
okay.
Modules. So I guess we're going to have short chapter, longer chapter, then shorter chapter. So that's good. Services, I think, and it's an interesting topic, like in domain-driven design context and in any kind of context, just because I think he even referenced this in the chapter a little bit, where a lot of times services get treated as kind of the catch-all, or the I don't really know where this goes, or I just want to I don't want to think about where this goes, so I'll just shove it into a service, and it's kind of this monolithic word that kind of applies to everything. So I found it refreshing to hear him talk about that and just read information about thinking about different types of services, and like really understanding that you need to be careful with saying something goes in a service. Like, you need to really think about why you're putting it there.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, for me, I think that kind of ties in what I was thinking. One of the nicest things about this was the really good definition of what a service is in a DDD concept, and it got DDD context, I should say. So, if anything, I mean, I guess for me, the meat of the chapter was really, this is what a service is in DDD, and from there, it was kind of, I guess the reason the chapter is so short, there's not an awful lot else you can write about. I mean, a service in a way is so specific to its individual use case. So he then spends a lot of the rest of the chapter going with an illustration, which obviously I thought was a good illustration and proved the point very well. But there didn't seem to be an awful lot more that could be said about the service other than what he said in those things.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, that was the whole discussion. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Yep, nice talking to you.
No, so Adrian has outed himself in chat as saying it's his usual MO to go ahead and just shove things into services, which that's something that I've done too. Just
really.
You're in the thick of things, and you're like, I really need to get this done, and I don't really. I mean, it doesn't really apply to any of my entities or any of my current models or whatever. So I'm just going to go ahead and shove it over here and just kind of pretend that this static method is legitimate or whatever. And I think that was something that he also touched on in the chapter, was when you run across the situation where you're thinking, well, this kind of applies to, and I think he was using a project for the SaaS Salvation thing. So he's like, there's this method that sort of applies to a project. It accesses something that a project knows about or is composed by, or is composed with. So I'm just going to add a static method on this project instance and use that, or I'm going to add it on the aggregate, or I'm going to add it on the repository and just kind of use it there. So I think it was nice to see that that's not something that's uncommon enough that it was left out of the book.
Yeah.
I found that very, very, very nice, very refreshing. Some information
this wasn't in the chapter, but maybe that's almost an anti-pattern, isn't it? It's like when you find yourself with a bit of functionality that you don't know where to put it, then it's time to put it in the service.
Yeah, probably. probably like I don't, and I think for me that would probably indicate, or if I was working on something, I would use that as an opportunity to say, do I really understand this model at this point, right? So I think that's the step that I've been missing most of my career has been, taking that step back and saying, well, this doesn't really fit in anything. So does that mean that this particular behavior or this particular action doesn't actually belong on any model, or does it mean that I don't know the model, or I've done a poor job of figuring it out? So I think that's something I'm going to take away from just reading this chapter is when you're dealing with where you want to put business logic, you should always really think about why you're moving things, uh, or like where you're putting things, and like really understand why you're doing that. Okay, did my video get really big?
It did, but that's okay.
That's kind of bizarre. Okay, well that's fine. We'll deal with it. I don't know what is up with that, so it's a cool effect I'm hearing. So that's good.
Yeah.
Um, sorry, that really distracted me. So yeah, some of the things that I think was interesting was starting out the chapter with what a domain service is not.
Yeah.
So I think that was something that I think is useful to really think about. The like we talk about like definitions of things, like what is a service, but it's more important to think about what is not a service, or like what we're not really talking about. So like things that come to mind are if you typically tell someone I'm going to work on a service, like the whole SOA thing immediately comes up. And so he addressed that as one of his first points was we're not talking about this monolithic service or this big service that lives somewhere else and we have to talk to it remotely, or we have to at least treat it that way. We're talking about things that are still part of your domain but just don't necessarily belong in an entity or a value object.
Absolutely. I think the other thing the thing that was really interesting for me was the idea that in the DDD context that a service is always stateless as well. So maybe that again is another pointer as to when you should be using a service or when you should be calling something explicitly a service.
Yeah, I think that's also definitely a good point. Is it? Yeah, so I think like just thinking about it like that's from the context of you don't necessarily, it's not going to be on an entity, so it's going to be something that lives somewhere else. So
Yeah.
if it belongs in a service, it's something that can be acted on stateless.
Yeah.
Hey, Bo.
Hey, how's it going?
You made it back from ORD. I see they finally let you out.
Yep.
This is
Yep.
just to catch you up. This has been a comedy of weird technical difficulties. So my video is very large for some reason. I don't know why. And
So you're the star of the show.
yeah, I don't know what's going on with that. So just letting you know. So we're talking about services, obviously. You had a chance to read the chapter, I assume.
Yep.
Yeah. Your first impressions? We kind of went through this already.
It was a surprisingly small chapter, and it was very code heavy. And the input or the output device that I had wasn't very good. I was reading it on my iPhone, so that didn't help a whole lot.
I can't imagine it would, but at least it was a small chapter. So we also commented on the brevity and also the fact that I think this was the first chapter that I would say actually belongs in a book called Implementing Domain-Driven Design, just because it did have quite a bit of code in it. So I was kind of relieved to see that.
Yeah.
Let's see what else. I found the talk about separate interfaces also kind of interesting. Just how it was like just really think about whether you need it or not, and then also I found the hint. I don't know if anyone was caught onto it, but when he was talking about naming actual classes for things, and he was saying that kind of the convention in the Java world would be to suffix the name of your class with IMPL, implementation, and he was saying at that point you should really think about the name. I know this doesn't really apply to services, but it was in the chapter, so we're going to discuss it. He said that if you feel the need to suffix the name of your class or your object with implementation or something to that effect, that probably means that you don't need that separate interface because the names are colliding. So really really look at that as a hint that you've probably done something wrong. If you can't come up with a concrete name for something, then that's an indicator that maybe you should think more about what you're actually doing. Did anybody else catch on to that? Or just skip over that section?
I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that I didn't think of it as I didn't give it an awful lot of weight, but I think you're quite right in in what you just said for sure.
Yeah, I know that it's a pretty common thing where I don't see the implementation suffix, people complaining about that as much as the interface suffix.
Yeah.
So I've seen similar arguments where if you have let's say you have some sort of class or some sort of interface where you've suffixed interface, and then the only implementing class is just named the same class name without the interface suffix. Yeah, it's the same sort of thing where why would you do that? Like if there's only going to be one actual implementation of that interface that doesn't have anything special about it that you can't qualify it, then why are you even bothering to create the interface at that point? And just create the actual class.
Yeah, I see that a lot too, of people wanting to suffix things with interface, and then also naming conventions for, like, I've got an abstract class, so it has to have the word abstract in it and that type of stuff, and that's always rubbed me the wrong way until I saw, so like the other pattern that I see a lot is I something whether for interfaces, so you have like capital I and then the name of the interface, and then I know earlier in the book he talked about that whole how if you read it in a sentence it makes sense, like if you actually talk about it being a role. I think that was this book where he talked about if you think of it being a role or something that it can do, and say I can do this or I am this or whatever. Like I think that's kind of an interesting take on it, but I'm curious if that's actually something that someone came up with after the fact. Like they started writing interfaces with the I in front of it to mean interface this, and then somebody said, well, this sucks. Let's come up with a reason for doing this to justify ourselves. So now we can, we read it in a sentence and it makes sense. Like I have my suspicions about that.
The object-oriented equivalent of a backronym.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think this chapter was. I mean, I was happy that it was short, but I think that kind of leaves us at a point that it's, or for me anyway, it just seemed kind of. Yeah, I really understood that. Like the few things I took away were just distinctions between different types of services. So really understanding that if it's something that is business logic, it should be in a domain service for the most part, and then dealing with application services or things that you'd normally put at that level, then put those elsewhere. And I think he referenced that we're going to talk about that later in another chapter called application. So it's kind of a moot point to really discuss at this point, I think. But just I was just happy to see that there is he is talking about the whole idea of keeping your domain logic inside your domain implementation, and services are first class and important citizens within that ecosystem as long as you understand why you're putting something into a service versus into value objects or entities.
I think for me it was also really good just to have the chapter just discussed and brought out into the open, what is a service and when is it appropriate to use it? Because I think it's, from what Jeff and I, what we were both saying earlier just before we came on, Bo, I think it was that we've both struggled with this in the past as well, is that you have a bit of functionality and you don't know where it should live, and do you bolt it onto here, it doesn't really live there, do you bolt it onto somewhere else where it doesn't really live, do you put it into a standalone static method, or do you end up crafting a single object which is then packed full of these static methods which are kind of homeless apart from that, or so just this kind of concept of just formalizing what you should do or how you should do that, I think is helpful, at least for me.
Yeah, I had I have a client that I've been working on, and I'm trying to push some of the, at least the high-level DDD concepts into the project, and I'm coming at it from more of like an outside, you could try this, you could try that sort of thing. I'm not actually doing the code for it, and we started working with Interactors. And he made the comment that he thought that interactors were basically services and that they were sort of interchangeable. But then at that point I wasn't really sure where the well, actually, no. He made the comment that he thought services represented use cases. So, and my understanding was that interactors were sort of basically the representation of a use case. So, I don't know how you would draw the line necessarily between what would be an interactor versus what would be a service. What do you guys think about that?
I've got the definition in when he defines a domain service open right in front of me, but I think the sentence to me was that when a significant process or transformation of the domain is not a natural responsibility of an entity or a value object, then add an operation to the model as a standalone interface declared as a service. So I think, yeah, and how that would differ from Interactor, now thinking about it, having read it again.
Yeah. So
in this kind of model, I mean,
my take on it was that
Interactor, but could you elaborate a little more on its role? Or?
Well, I think the way that I understood interactors was that they were more that they're on the boundary between the ports and adapters side of thing. So they do represent a use case, and they're at the boundary between the application. Maybe they're at the boundary between the application and the domain.
Okay.
So that they're basically taking the raw inputs and translating them into useful things. So they sort of act, but I think the thing was that I can see how you could look at them as being similar to services, but in my mind they were different, and I wasn't really sure I was super clear on why I thought they were different. So
I think for me, I've usually seen interactors being something like I guess like a thing that usually they have like a perform method or something like that. So they're like a command type of object. So they're just something that's just, I need to take this and then execute this particular piece of functionality. Like, so like a common example I think I've seen would be something like authenticate user. So in the same context that he talked about in here, where you've got this interactor that's saying, that's what I want to do. I want you to actually take from this controller and do this. Like, I think that's what I've usually seen interactors do. And then the actual business logic or the logic behind that would be something that would be like in authentication, something like user.authenticate whatever. So I think from my perspective, in that case, an interactor would be kind of the package that takes what you want to do from a controller and passes it through an application service or that sort of thing, which is actually handling the coordination of the logic, or it could be something that replaces or lives side by side with an application service and talks to a business or a domain service to actually do the authentication. Does that make sense?
yeah, I think so. I go to my default example with the doucheswag project, and so I was looking at those interactors to sort of better understand, and I can see how those were listed as those were very clearly use cases, but I could see how some of what they were doing inside those use cases could have been should arguably have been domain services as opposed to some weird interactor concept outside. So I guess the way that I'm slowly starting to better understand interactors is that it is at the boundary. So basically, the test cases that he had for testing out the services in the book look to me like what an interactor would look like. Like the authentication domain service could be called by an authentication interactor, and the interactor's its job is to basically take the raw input of strings and then create basically run the service for you. But I haven't seen anyone really do that, so I don't know if that's really the right way to look at it. So like you said, the common use case for an interactor that you've seen is authenticating users, but we just saw a really in-depth example of authenticating users as a domain service. So I think they probably work together. I'm just not quite sure I've seen that in the wild before.
Yeah, I would almost argue that against having it at the domain boundary, performing that it seems that, at least what I've been reading so far, that at the domain boundary is where you define access points into your individual domain. So the access point might be HTTP, it might be AMQP, it might be something else entirely. And by performing that logic at that point, you're potentially then leaving yourself open to the necessity to replicate code and logic. So that would seem to me to be an argument for having this done more deeply in the domain level. So I mean, I wonder if that's just the definition. I entirely see your point that there are a lot of similarities between the way you're describing interactors and the domain services. But for me, the thing about the domain service was, and I don't know how valuable this is just in terms of that it's an operation that happens on one or more domain models or one or more domain entities. And because it operates directly on those or directly with those entities, that therefore it belongs more at in the actual domain itself rather than at the boundary of the domain. Now, I don't know if that clarifies things at all.
For a service, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But an interactor, I think, is what, Bo, you were saying that an interactor is something that lives in the boundary, right? No? Yes? Are you muted?
Yeah, the interactor lives at the boundary. So I guess when I'm looking at the douchewag example, I'm almost seeing another way that could be further, what's the word? Further refactored into basically extracting some parts of those interactors into domain services that could be tested even at a more isolated level and used, basically used by the interactors, and then the interactors become even more generic, I guess, or less business logic in the interactors and put more of that in domain services.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's kind of where I see it fitting together in the puzzle so I just pulled up douchewag just for the fun of it, and there's this user login interactor that is being built. So it's got a invoke method, which is the same form thing, and so all it does is take a request in and then go through the user repository and look for them by the email address in the request, use a password encoder to figure out if the hash matches the requested password, throws exceptions if the user is not found, or returns a login response that has the user object created into a user view. So I think from my perspective, the only thing that I would really have inside that invoke method would be I guess just that return statement, and then it calls a service instead. So it's calling a service to do all the logic side of things, so dealing with looking up the repository and that sort of thing. So move that from the application level, I guess, move it from the interactor side of things and put it into a domain somewhere. So it is or even if the interactor lives within that domain, just it's something that's kind of the pass through for that.
Yeah,
that's how I would see it.
I completely agree, because my understanding so far was it's something that lives at the domain boundary, that its responsibility should just be to receive inputs, to call something within the domain that then produces data, and then the interactor or whatever it is at the boundary is then responsible for taking that data and formatting it into an appropriate kind of response. It would seem to me that any domain logic at that layer is almost, to me, as a code smell. That's kind of my first reaction on that, anyway.
It would be interesting to play with, because I can definitely see that if you have these interactors set up like this, like the biggest concern that I would have with exposing that level of detail outside of a domain service or an entity or something like that is repeatability, or like the fact that you would have to have all this implicit knowledge or explicit knowledge in all the client code. So like any place that you wanted to authenticate someone, you would have to know all the steps required. So you'd have to know about password hashing. So you have to know how that's handled in your application and so on and so forth. So that type of stuff would be duplicated. But I think if you're using interactor concept, I think the way this is organized anyway, you're not really duplicating it. So I guess from that perspective, I would say that these are kind of, in my opinion, doubling as interactors and services. I think that's where your confusion was, Bo. I think these are actually doing both jobs.
Yeah.
So I would say
I think they are. But yeah, I hadn't. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I would say for me, I would say that's not really right. But who am I to judge? I'm just some guy, right? I'm just some guy reading a book. That's all I'm doing. Yeah, so I think that that's kind of
Yeah.
what he was getting at in his examples in the book anyway, like was trying to figure out where that logic goes, and so like what is it a part of, and so that's why he used that whole authentication example is kind of useful just because it's something everyone understands, but how he had it built into, I'm trying to remember, I'm trying to find it actually, but he had the whole information stored inside the uh, he just had it in some random file, I guess, and he was checking, authentic, or I guess that was the point where he had the word authentic, and he was saying, is this user is authentic, and then if they are, check their password or whatever, or check their password to figure out if they're authentic, and then return that. And so I think that whole progression was just kind of illustrating the point that you really need to understand where things belong. And so at that point, I would say keeping it inside the interactor is a mistake if the interactor is not doubling as a service. No disagreements? Come on, I want to fight about this subject.
No, I think that some of the questions that I have are probably more along the lines of differentiating between application level stuff and services. So I'm thinking some of the things that I'm thinking about will probably be resolved in future chapters if we're talking about applications. Because at some point something has to stop talking to the domain model. And it's not clear to me at what point you can stop talking to repositories directly. So, for example, with these particular interactors, they're dealing directly with like repositories and entities and creating value objects. Like where at what point should we no longer be doing that? Or is there a point? And where's that line where the application starts and where it starts getting more into the domain part of it? So I don't know. Maybe I'm making this way more complicated than it needs to be. But yeah, anyway.
Okay, you're saying as far as the interactors, or as far as services, like are you asking like whether services should have?
Well, just in general. Well, it's clear to me that it's clear that domain services should have access to the repositories and the factories and the other domain services, but application services, what should they have access to, or does it matter? And what makes them application services versus domain services? Like I said, it might be in future chapters.
Yeah, given that we're not there yet, I'm just going to use my basic understanding or what I've been operating against thus far is that application services don't have access to stuff like repositories, that sort of thing. If they actually need to communicate through the domain, they usually do it through a service of some kind. So like usually an application service is the glue that binds them, or that I've used to bind services that are inside my like actual domain services to the outside world. But I mean, that is probably a fundamentally flawed way of explaining it. But like I've always used it to just kind of they know some of like it. Obviously, it'll know the language, I guess, of individual subcontexts and that sort of thing. But it isn't directly accessing repositories and that sort of thing. So anything that it needs to do is actually going through another component, another service of some type. That's just how I've done it, but I don't know like if we'll have to get there. And I flipped through just to see when we'll figure out the answer to that, and it's chapter 14. So just letting you know.
We're halfway there.
Yeah, might be time to skip ahead to figure it out.
I think it's a very valid point because everything we've dealt with so far in this book has been specifically about modeling business logic.
Yeah.
There's nothing yet which is talked about, as Bo said, about how do you actually then bind this together with a web application or with whatever kind of application you're building. So, and I think there are pointers, in terms of the entry points into at the boundaries of the domain. But he hasn't really gone on to discuss that yet. So I think, yeah, that is definitely for me as well a big missing piece. Something I'm looking forward to seeing. But yeah.
Well, that is what chapter 14 is all about. That's the actual last
I'm
chapter
mostly
of the
bringing
book.
it up.
You're what?
Nice. So yeah, I'm mostly bringing this up because I actually ran into this this week. So it's fresh in my mind because I wrote like, I don't know, 4 or 5 emails back and forth with someone on this week. So uh, it was relevant to me to bring it up tonight.
And no conclusive answer after 4 or 5 emails?
Out of curiosity, what did you? What
Oh
was?
no, I mean it was more just
Go on. Sorry, go on.
what was what?
No, go ahead. I'll ask my question
What were you
afterwards.
asking?
You go ahead. I'll ask my question afterwards.
Oh, uh, it wasn't really a definitive answer. Basically, he's putting code up, and I'm looking at the code and kind of giving my thoughts on it. And the uh, the first interactor that he had written up, well, he actually didn't do the interactor first. He did the test first for the interactor, and I offered suggestions on how to change the test and sort of implied some design changes on the interactor. And that's when we started discussing what his idea was for the interactor. And he saw it as, he mentioned that he thought they were use cases. And I hadn't, or he'd seen interactors talked about as being use cases, and he always thought that's what services were as well. Services were supposed to represent a use case. So he saw them as equal. And I was trying to find a way. In my head, I knew they weren't. I know the ones at the boundary and the others like domain logic, but when I started looking at like the douche sway examples, I'm like, well, they're really kind of blurring the lines there. So so it wasn't so much that we actually came away from it with like a definitive answer. I gave my suggestion for how I would have changed it based on his actual use case was creating a company. And he'd sort of created an interactor for saving a company. So his test was creating a brand new company and then saving it with the repository. Whereas what he was actually doing, and what I kind of explained through the emails, was you're actually creating an interactor to create a company. So that's a very specific use case. So he had like repository.save and all of these things in there. I'm like, so I was suggesting to actually model the actual use case as the interactor, but now I'm thinking, well, it could have been a create company service, which might have been more appropriate to have a create company domain service, and then his create company interactor just calls the domain service. So anyway, it was really close to what we're talking about, like almost like a pure example of this is a use case. How do we model it? So it was really fun to kind of review all of this and kind of get your two opinions on it.
I wonder if it would have been. I'm assuming that from what you're describing, that it's part of one single application. But
yeah, so it was one single application.
I wonder if you thought of it. So I wonder if the distinction between interactor and domain service becomes clearer if let's say you're modeling an application on a service-oriented architecture, and your front end, your web front end, has to send an AMQP message to some sort of DDD context, bounded context, which is then going to then perform the operation, which is actually creates and saves the company and returns some sort of message to you. In that context, then the idea of the interactor is that it strictly is just bound to a message queue, and it receives the message, processes it, and puts another message onto another queue with a kind of a response. And that, for me, at least in my mind, is simply breaks down the distinction between what the interactor's job is and what the domain service's job is. I think it's easy to confuse the roles of things when it's all bound up into one big application as opposed to broken apart maybe into smaller ones. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the other interesting thing for me is that the way that this application it's kind of a test bed for him to try out some new ideas, and kind of wanted the reason that I'm involved is because he wanted to like basically have someone else to look over the ideas to make sure that he's not really going totally crazily in the wrong direction. And one of the things that he wanted to do was start first with the interactors and then move his way down into the domain. So he has a general idea of what the model looks like for, say, company, what the company aggregate looks like, and then he wants to start by writing the test for the interactors, and then kind of bubble its way down into the repositories and the other services and the entities themselves, and basically write the test first, and then write the domain code to match it. And I'm not sure I'm on board with that. And I said as much. I don't think I like that way of doing development. Like, that I don't like. Yeah, I don't like going that high up the stack and working all the way down. I'm learning that I'm more about testing the smaller pieces first. Like, get the entities working first and the value objects, and get those interactions and test those, and then start building stuff around them. But I know that can be painful if you start making massive tests to your entities and value objects. If as you work with it, everything changes, of course. So, but yeah, it's starting that high level up of, here's a very specific use case of creating my aggregate root, and then kind of filtering down to everything that's needed to make the aggregate root exist at all, and make the entities exist and the relationships, and it'll be interesting to see how that works out. I'm a little skeptical to see if that's going to be easy or not for him. So
it's kind of an interesting take on outside-in development, right? Like that's, or at least that's what it kind of sounds like. It sounds like the idea of having something very, very high level first. Like, so you're saying like he's writing like a really high level test and then having nothing underneath it, and then using that to formulate the creation of other tests lower, or he's just saying I want to do this and then implementing the high level interactor, then implementing all the domain services that make that behavior work? Or am I just completely lost?
Yeah, I think he'll I think his idea is to make the tests along the way, because he seems very sold on the test first, like write the test first and then write the code to make it work. I always thought that was TDD, but I never really studied TDD. But as I'm learning more about it, I'm realizing that test first development isn't necessarily always, like, that's not what TDD is explicitly. Always writing tests first, I don't think. Is it?
Are you asking if TDD means you should write your tests first?
Yes.
In a nutshell, yes. In a nutshell, the whole premise behind test-driven development is that it allows you to emerge the design and emerge the functionality inside your code. So in the theoretical side of TDD, anyway, every piece of production code that you write must be the result of a failing test. So in true TDD, you can't write production code until you have a test that fails. Like, that's just the way it works. So you are always writing, it is always test, then production code. So like, whether a lot of people practice that, not many people that I know practice that to the theoretical extreme, but in how it should be practiced, or in how it was originally developed, and if you watch things that people like Uncle Bob and Martin Fowler and those groups have said, or those people have said, it is the whole notion that you do not write production code unless you have a test that's failing. That's the rule. So that's, if you, and the point of that, I think the whole point of that whole concept is to think in small units, and to actually get you to think about why you're writing the code that you're writing, as opposed to writing like 5 tests and then going on that and saying, okay, well, I've got these 5 tests, let me work on it. You should be working on one small piece of a test at a time. So like, you're working very small units of tests, very small units of production code, changing, we're talking like 3 lines at a time, as opposed to what, and I'll go ahead and admit this on YouTube, but some things that I normally do is I know the 6 cases that I need to cover, whatever, so I'll stub out those 6 tests, and they'll be a pending format, and then I'll say, let me write a little bit in this one, and say, well, I know that's going to be refactored later, so let me move that out, and so by the time I'm done, I've got these 2 or 3 tests actually written before I start writing any production code. Like, I do that frequently, and it's a really bad habit, but that's just how it works sometimes.
You're a
So
bad man.
I know. I should just quit this whole development
Yeah.
thing and go be a manager or something.
It's funny because
So yeah, I guess that the theoretical TDD is at least the way you're describing it now sounds like what I assumed it was. My understanding is that he's full on trying to do that now. A bunch of the stuff that I've seen lately on all the TDD is dead and a couple of other things that I've read sort of made me think that maybe that wasn't all there was to it and that I'd misunderstood it this whole time. I've never ever written a test first. I've never have. I think it's the spike and stabilize thing is probably the closest thing to what I do. So I've never really read up on TDD and I've never written tests first. So anyway.
I'm the same.
What were you going to say, Jeremy?
No, I was going to say I'm exactly the same. I did have one earlier thought that so when you initially described the way that your friend is approaching this problem, my initial thought was that's crazy, and then the more I thought about it, the more I started to think that maybe it's not, because what I was kind of thinking is it kind of lets you write your application, like the front end, the actual web part of it, what somebody is going to see. And you could potentially, in this method, you can actually stub out the interactors, the actual point at which the point of entry into domains, and have it return canned data until you're actually ready to implement the domain. So it could be a way of quickly prototyping something. If you have a good idea of the kind of data that your domain is going to produce in the format, but by actually defining from the top down as opposed from the bottom up, that might be a quick way of doing it. So as I say, my initial thought was it's crazy, and then I started to think about it. I started to think, well, maybe there's a lot of merit to it.
I'm curious to see how it works out. Like I said, I'm a little skeptical just because I feel like it. My gut instinct is to not go up to that high of a level. Basically do all of one aggregate first, and then do another aggregate, and then do any relationships between them or whatever. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it works out. And I gave him my suggestions, and he said he was totally on board with this TDD thing and wants to basically write all of the tests first, and write tests first before he writes code that can fulfill those tests. So it'll be fun to watch how it goes.
So maybe next time we talk, you'll be able to say, I finally wrote a test before I wrote production code.
Maybe. Is that a challenge?
No, I mean, I think everyone should try it. I think everyone should at least. I mean, the whole TDD, like you brought this up, but the whole TDD is dead stuff that's been going around, I think is a lot of it comes because people misunderstand what TDD is saying. Like, people think that TDD is about writing all your regression tests first, but really that's not what TDD is all about. It's not necessarily about, I mean, or at least the way I understand, the way I practice it, is it has really nothing to do with all the dealing with invalid inputs and that type of stuff. Like, I normally don't write those as my very first. I don't think about that. I really kind of use it to emerge the design of how objects collide or collaborate together, as opposed to just thinking about like individual methods and testing those in all their input variations. Like, eventually I'll get around to that, but the original, like the starting point is I'm trying to design an object as if I'm using it in my system. So I'm actually designing how it behaves and who it talks to and that sort of stuff. So that kind of gives me signals as to whether I'm putting too many responsibilities on a class, and whether that class is named correctly, and that type of stuff. So that's kind of where I think the power is. So I think everyone should, at some point, take a small problem and TDD the solution to it. And I'm not talking about like FizzBuzz. I'm talking like a small, repeatable problem that you could think of. So I'm trying to think of a really good example that would work all the time. Like, you could think of something like a shopping cart or an e-commerce platform. Like, that type of stuff is pretty easy to understand the domain of how it works. So I tend to use it as examples a lot. But that, I would say TDD, a basic e-commerce platform, just over a weekend or something, just to get the experience of how would I make a cart? How does a cart interact with my inventory system? And then from that, you'll be able to see how you can TDD just a cart object within a system that you don't actually have all the rest of the stuff implemented yet.
Another one might be the example from the book, the actual authentication.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, I can, yeah. I've been meaning to make myself sit down and just literally try and put myself in that mindset and do it on, you know, a short term or a medium term, and just see how it fits with me. It's more just a matter of just, you know, taking myself out of my familiar patterns of development and just making myself try it that particular way.
Now we have the very difficult task of trying to associate or bring that all back to domain services. Who's going to take a stab at that?
I think as Bo raised it, he should do that.
Yeah, Bo, it's on you, man. You gotta bring this all back to domain services.
Oh, how do I bring this back to domain services?
You actually have a really good.
Well, I think that. What's that?
No, I was saying you have a really easy way to
What
do
did
it
you say?
because the last section was on testing services, so you could just talk about the differences in what he was talking about in testing.
Yeah, actually, so yeah, so that was actually one of the things I was thinking earlier too, and thank you for reminding me that he actually made a point of saying that sometimes there are cases where he doesn't, you don't have to write tests first. It's not a requirement, and that he just I think he said the reason he didn't in the book this time was for this particular chapter was because it felt more natural to show the tests later. Whereas in the other examples in the book previously, it had made more sense to show the tests earlier. So yeah, thank you for handing me that one.
You're welcome. But yeah, so I think to your point, I think something that he was saying was that it's when you're talking about services, especially the progression that he went through in the book of how to figure out where code goes, like it wouldn't necessarily be advantageous to even talk about tests first in that point because you don't even know where the code lives yet, so you don't yet know where to put it, and then even writing a test for a stateless object is very difficult. So until you kind of know how it's going to fit into your model, whether it's going to be in a service or entity or something, it's very difficult to do the whole TDD process. So I think that's an area that would be a struggle to figure out how to listen to tests. Like if you're practicing TDD, I'm kind of curious how I would know as I'm writing a test, oh, this kind of looks like it should be a service, right? Like, I think that would be something useful for me to try to figure out is if I'm writing a test and I start feeling that whole, well, does this really belong in this object? What are the kind of smells that you would see in a test, or what are the indicators within a test that you would see that would tell you maybe this should be pulled out into a service somewhere?
So I have the page open.
Well, yeah.
That list of the criteria he had. So I mean that would, I guess, I mean he has three criteria in the book, and I'll read them out for just to be clear. But he says a domain service will often perform a significant business process, transform a domain object from one composition to another, calculate a value requiring input from more than one domain object. And I guess those for me are probably three good criteria that would instantly say to me that what I'm working on should be a service.
So basically, if you were writing a test and you had some very complicated...
So based on the...
You've got some serious delay out there on the West Coast, man.
It's really bad hotel Wi-Fi.
Go ahead.
No, you were talking.
Oh. No, I was just saying, like, I guess at that point, if you were writing a test and you've got a bunch of collaboration going on, you've got something that's requiring many things in order to make a composition or in order to do a calculation, that sort of thing. So his three examples, I think that would be an obvious one for me, but I'm sure there's some subtleties because he even mentioned that there were several other uh, reasons. Like I think he said these three were just kind of the top ones for him, and then the last one was more or less just an explicit statement of the first one. So I think that would be something that I would be really interested to try to even compile a list of things that I saw in tests. I've been meaning to do that anyway. Of just when you're writing a test and you see this means you need to do this action. So I would be interested to try to do that. That's all I was saying. So, Bo, you're up now.
Oh, yeah, I think that criteria is really good to look at. So, for example, when I look at the douchewag things, in particular the bid, I think I linked that in the group chat. When I look at the invoke method, I see tons of collaborators. I actually see explicitly using a converter
Yeah.
service to convert the input into something called converted, using that to create a new value object, and then calling bid on an entity. So when I see that, I feel like, to me, my brain immediately says that should be a service.
Yeah,
And I think that was pretty similar to what I saw in the initial. Yeah. And when I saw the initial test that my friend had been working on, he was using I think he was using at least two repositories. Might have just been one. And then he was creating a new instance of a value object and passing it to a new instance of a entity, and then passing it all to a repository and calling save on it. So when I see all of that collaboration, it jumps out at me right away that should probably be a service, because that's something very specific to the domain. Like, I want to be able to test that just in its own thing. Like, this is important. We're creating this entity, and it needs to have these appropriate values. So I think that it's probably pretty easy to see services if you look at them from that perspective of, lots of collaborators creating instances of things and converting them to something else, or passing them around in different ways. So I don't know. It looks kind of easy, but I can also see how it would be easy to fall into the trap of, oh, everything's a service. So yeah, I think as for as little as this chapter was, I think it was really, really good to start some conversations in my own brain and thinking about how these things should work together.
So I think that means, just from that last little bit of statement, or last little bit of your statement there, I think that means that the past two chapters have introduced topics that are traps, because I think one of the things was, working with value objects, it's very easy to say, well, everything's a value object. Now I'm going to use value objects for other things. And now we've got services where it's pretty easy for us to say, well, everything can kind of be a service, so let's move all of our logic there. And I think that was a caution that he had in this chapter, was be very wary of that, because once you start putting everything into services, you actually are creating a form of anemic domain model. Even if they are domain services, you're taking away stuff that actually belongs in a JSON value object. So yeah, I think your point of being very vigilant about what you're putting into services is important.
I wonder if one of the indications that you need a domain service, and this kind of comes back to the example as well, is that you have an operation which does involve, which crosses the model boundaries. So in his case, it was the idea of the tenant and the user, and that the user shouldn't be authenticated if the tenant is inactive, if the actual the client is inactive. So that for me might be, a warning sign I'll look for in the future, that if I'm performing some sort of domain logic that involves more than one model at a time, then that's probably a case that an indicator to me that I need to be using a service.
I would definitely agree with that. So especially if you've got multiple aggregates or something going on, then yeah, that's automatically, for me, that's okay, is this actually a part of this particular object, or is it something that belongs to the service? I think that's a good point. I can't really refute that, so I won't even try. I think that's pretty much it that
So
Oh, go ahead.
in this discussion, in this discussion, I sort of was reminded of something that Igor shared with me a long time ago, um, and it's only semi-related to what we're talking about. But have either of you read the Execution in the Kingdom of Nouns?
I
Oh,
don't believe I
I just
have.
linked it in the group chat.
Okay, you are now responsible
Yeah,
for making show notes for this.
it's actually a pretty lengthy. Oh. But it's actually a relatively lengthy read about how I think most of it has to do with Java and the fact that they're very noun happy since they're all objects. So you end up with like a runner that has an execute method was one of the early examples, and lots of managers and all of these other things. And I feel like services could really easily get into that state of mind where you have an authenticator service that has an authenticate method, and you have let's see, like what was it had another example, a serializer service that has a serialize method, or you end up with these actions that services are supposed to do. So the naming, you basically end up with this noun object instance that has to do something. I don't know. I haven't seen a whole lot of talk about functions, I guess, and any of the domain stuff or DDD stuff that we've been talking about. I don't know how that could really play into this very well, where everything so far has been interfaces and instances of or implementations of interfaces, or just straight up classes. But there hasn't been a lot of talk about like domain functions, or in here that actually explicitly talks about static methods on classes that were extracted into a service. So basically you have a function that they promoted to an object whose sole purpose is to run that function. Whereas, our first thought might actually have been to just create it as a static function. In fact, that's what he said that's what he said the fictional company did. But then that wasn't right. We needed to create an authenticator service that authenticated. Anyway, it might be an interesting read. I don't know if anyone's done any look at how to integrate domain functions, or if those even have a place in DDD or not. But it's kind of a fun read, and I felt like it was semi-loosely related to our service talk here.
I think something to keep in mind is the author of this book is very heavily influenced by his Java experience. So naturally, there's going to be some things that lead him towards, for example, putting things into objects. I think that's just something to keep in mind. Like as you're if you're approaching it from a perspective where you can create functions and don't necessarily have to have an applicate or an authentication service if a domain function or something. I doubt that he would talk about it in here just because it's not something that's accessible to him normally, right?
Mm-hmm. I've never seen anyone talk about it. Have you?
I can't think of anyone who has, no.
A thought just came to mind, and this would need some more thought, but I wonder if the domain service can be, if we think of objects, domain models as being nouns, then the domain service is actually more of a verb that's performing the action on that thing itself. It was just a thought that came into my mind. It may not have any value at all.
Yeah, I can see it. I think at that point I would be a little confused between difference between services and so I usually think of interactors as being a verb of some type. So I don't know. I think it's worth exploring at least. Oh, I can never tell if you're getting ready to say something or if you're just puzzled or. Okay. I guess. All right. I guess you're not saying anything. So, like I said, I think that was all I gleaned out of this chapter. Is there anything else you want to cover that's?
Do I spend a lot of time? So you think I spend a lot of time looking puzzled?
Well, I think it's just today because I think there's enough of a delay between when we say something and then when you hear it that it looks like you're obviously just listening to what we're saying or whatever, but it's like there's a pause or whatever. You're sitting there kind of looking at the computer, so it just looks like you're processing something, which is just the delay. So yeah, it's pretty humorous.
Joining us tonight live by satellite from Western
Yeah.
Australia, I suppose.
From the middle of the jungle, it's he's on a little satellite. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anything else you wanted to cover, Jeremy?
No, I think that's nope. It's a good conversation.
Bo, are you good?
I am good.
And Adrian?
I'm super happy I was able to make it tonight.
Yeah, that is awesome. I'm glad that you made it out of ORD. That it's a fate I wouldn't wish upon anyone is to get stuck in that airport. So.
Adrian just wrote in the group chat. This was great! Exclamation point.
Exclamation point. All right, and then like I said, Bo's gonna go ahead and make some show notes for tonight, so we'll have links and everything everywhere. I'm just kidding, Bo. I'll take care of that.
Nice.
So, thanks for joining. We're gonna try to do this in 2 weeks. We're gonna go talk about domain events. So 2 weeks. Unless you guys want to switch to next week, or is 2 weeks fine?
2 weeks is fine with me. What does that take us to? Middle of May. Yeah, it's okay with me. If it's okay with Bo and you with Jeff.
Yeah, that's the 13th of May.
I don't think there's anything significant.
How close is that to Tech?
That's the week before Tech.
How close? Okay, then it should be fine.
Yeah, I'm flying out the following Tuesday. That's the 20th. That's the tutorial day of Tech. So.
Wow, Tech. Yeah, Tech's long. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, Tech is basically the whole week if you count.
Okay. Yeah, I should be. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The 13th should be fine for me.
All right, so I'll put it down on the 13th. I'll make an event early and make sure it's the correct type of event, unless Google Hangouts changes the way that works again before I do that. So we'll have that scheduled. This will obviously be posted right after, and I'll get. And it's good for Adrian, so that's good. So I'll get some notes up, and I will see you guys in 2 weeks.
Great.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, sounds good. Thanks.
Have a good evening.
You too.